It's quite possibly the earliest that we've ever seen it released, but the preliminary entry list for the 2024 Rolex 24 at Daytona has been released. 60 cars are set to take to the track for the January Endurance Classic that will feature 4 classes spanning GTP, LMP2, GTD PRO, and GTD. We're not going to mess around, let's jump right into the entry list here, starting with the GTD class. Now, the 2024 edition of the Rolex 24 will feature 25 GTD class entries. That is an increase of 2 from what we saw on the grid last year. It starts off with a familiar entry in the number 12 Vassar Sullivan Lexus RCF GT3 featuring drivers Frankie Montecalvo, Parker Thompson, and Aaron Telitz. They're joined by the number 13 and number 17 AWA Corvette Z06 GT3Rs of Ore Fadani, Matt Bell, and Lars Kern in the number 13, with Anthony Mantella, Nico Veroni, Thomas Merrill, and Charlie Eastwood featured in the number 17 entry. The number 21 AF Corsa Ferrari 296 will be driven by Simon Mann, Francois Hérault, and Kay Cozzolino. It's also worth noting here that not all of the cars have their full driver lineups confirmed yet. Fellow Ferrari 296 entry from Triarsi Competizioni, the 023, will be driven by Alessio Rivera, Onofrio Triarsi, Ricky Agostini, and Charlie Scardinia. Former winners of this race, the 27 Heart of Racing Aston Martin Vantage, will be driven by Zachary Robichon, Roman DeAngelis, Marco Sorensen, and Ian James. Meanwhile, the first Mercedes on the list, the number 32 Korthoff Preston Motorsports AMG, will be driven by Mike Skeen, Mikel Grenier, Kenton Cook, and Maxi Goetz. The full season Ferrari entry from Conquest Racing will be driven by Alessandro Balzan, Cedric Sabarazzulli, and Manny Franco, with a driver to be announced. Number 43 Andretti Motorsports Porsche 911 GT3R will be driven by Jared Andretti, Gabby Chavez, and Scott Hargrove, with a to be announced driver. Meanwhile, number 44 Magnus Racing Aston Martin will be driven by John Potter, Andy Lally, Spencer Pompelli, with a to be announced driver. The number 45 Wayne Taylor Racing with Andretti Lamborghini Huracan will be driven by Lamborghini Super Trofeo champions Kyle Marcelli and Danny Formal, with their 2 co-drivers to be announced. The number 47 Centelar Racing Ferrari will be driven by Roberto Lacorte, Giorgio Sarnagiato, Eddie Cheever, with a to be announced driver. The number 53 MDK Motorsports Porsche 911 GT3R has a stable of to be announced drivers, as does the number 55 Proton Competition Ford Mustang GT3. Bit of a surprise entry on the grid here, but we're going to be seeing one of those Ford Mustangs that Proton is expected to be running in the WEC over here in Imsa, at least for the first race of the season. The number 57 Windward Racing Mercedes AMG will be back on the grid with Russell Ward, Daniel Morad, and 2 to be announced drivers. The number 60 Iron Lynx Lamborghini Huracan will be driven by Claudio Schiavone and Matteo Cressoni, with 2 to be announced drivers. Meanwhile, the number 66 Gradient Racing Acura NSX GT3 Evo will feature a familiar 2 drivers, as Catherine Legg will once again join up with Sheena Monk and 2 to be announced drivers. Number 70 Inception Racing McLaren of Brendan Arieb, Frederick Shandorf, Ali Milroy, and Tom Gamble will once again return to the GTD ranks, as will the number 78 Forte Racing Lamborghini Huracan of Misha Goiberg and Laura Spinelli. They will be joined by 2 drivers that have yet to be announced. And they aren't on the full season entry list, but the number 80 Lone Star Racing Mercedes AMG will join the GTD ranks for the Rolex 24 with a stable of to be announced drivers. Fresh off their recent WEC victory in the GTE AM class, the Iron Dames number 83 Lamborghini will be driven by Michelle Gadding, Sarah Bovey, and Rahel Frey, with a to be announced driver. The number 86 MDK Motorsports Porsche 911 GT3R will be driven by Kurong Lee and Anders Fjordbach, with 2 to be announced drivers. Number 91 Kelly Moss with Riley Porsche 911 GT3R have yet to announce any of their drivers. And the number 96 Turner Motorsport BMW will feature Robbie Foley, Patrick Gallagher, Michael Deenan, and Jans Klingman. Notably, no Bill Oberlin in that entry. And the last entry on the GTD grid will be the number 120 Wright Motorsports Porsche 911 GT3R, and they have not announced any drivers there. As you can tell, there's a heck of a lot of cars that are going to be on that GTD grid, and some very strong lineups featuring there as well, with drivers that we know well that have competed in Imsa for a number of years, new drivers to this series, new teams that are entering the series, and also teams and drivers that are moving from other classes like LMP3 into the GTD ranks. The racing flew a little bit under the radar at last year's Rolex 24 with the addition of the new GTP class cars, but this GTD class is definitely going to be one to watch heading into this year's Rolex. Now, from an absolutely packed GTD class, we move on to, once again, a large grid in the GTD Pro ranks. In fact, it features 13 cars, a very healthy grid size, and this is actually personally one of the classes that I'm looking forward to watching the most at this year's Rolex, and it's not just because they've increased from their 10 cars they had on the grid last year, but I mean, just hold on a second and look at some of these lineups. They're absolutely incredible from top to bottom, and it all starts with the number 1 Paul Miller Racing BMW, last year's GTD champions by a landslide. Brian Sellers, Madison Snow, Neil Verhagen, and Sheldon van der Linde will be the 4 drivers in that car. They're also joined by the number 3 and number 4 Corvette Racing by Pratt Miller Motorsports Corvette Z06 GT3Rs. In the number 3, it will be Antonio Garcia, Alexander Sims, and Danny Juncadella, while in the number 4, it will be Tommy Milner, Nicky Katzberg, and Earl Bamber. A reminder for you, in the GTD Pro class, 4 driver lineups are not mandated, so we may see an extra driver added in here, but we also may not. In the number 9 Pfaff Motorsports McLaren, we will see Ollie Jarvis, Marvin Kirchhofer, James Hinchcliffe, and Alexander Rossi in that lineup. Meanwhile, number 14 Vassar Sullivan Lexus, you'll see Ben Barnicoat, Jack Hawksworth, Kyle Kirkwood, and a to-be-announced driver. For the number 19 Iron Lynx Lamborghini, there will be Mirko Bortolotti, Jordan Pepper, Andrea Caldarelli, and Frank Pereira. While in the number 23 Heart of Racing Aston Martin Vantage, it will feature Ross Gunn, Alex Riberas, and Mario Farnbacher. The number 62 Risi Competizione Ferrari 296 will see David Rigon, Daniel Serra, and Alessandro Piriguidi piloting that car. Before we get to a pair of Ford Multimatic Motorsports entries, the number 64 Ford Mustang GT3 will feature Mike Rockenfeller, Harry Tinkle, and a to-be-announced driver, while the number 65 will feature Joey Hand, Dirk Mueller, and another to-be-announced driver. The number 75 Sun Energy 1 Mercedes will race in the Pro class and feature a stable of to-be-announced drivers, while the number 77 AO Racing Porsche 911 GT3R, aka Rexy, although we don't know if the Rexy livery is going to be making its way up to GTD Pro, but it will feature Sebastian Prio, Lauren Heinrich, and a to-be-announced driver. And rounding out the class, number 92 Kelly Moss with Riley, Porsche 911 GT3R, well, they have not announced any of their drivers yet. I mentioned that we've seen some incredible racing in the GTD classes. I fully expect that to also be taking place in the GTD Pro classes. These factory lineups are always just going nose to tail, super close racing in that class, and you know that it's going to come down to the final couple of hours, with especially how stacked some of these lineups are. Not to be forgotten in all of this, though, is the LMP2 grid, which is pretty darn healthy as well. It's a class that continues to grow, and this year it's going to have 12 entries, which is up from the 10 that we saw at last year's Rolex. It started off with the number 2 United Autosports entry of Ben Hanley, Ben Keating, and Nico Pino, along with a to-be-announced driver. I think we'll be talking a lot about them battling with the 04 CrowdStrike Racing by APR entry this year that will feature George Kurtz, Colin Braun, and a couple of to-be-announced drivers. Meanwhile, the number 8 Tower Motorsports entry has yet to announce any of their drivers, while the number 11 TDS Racing entry will feature Stephen Thomas, Mikael Jensen, Hunter McElray, and a to-be-announced driver. The number 18 Era Motorsports Orica will feature Dwight Merriman, Ryan DeLille, and Christian Rasmussen in for the Rolex. Meanwhile, the number 20 High Class Racing entry will feature Seth Lucas and Dennis Anderson, the only 2 drivers that have been announced there, while the number 22 United Autosports entry will feature Dan Goldberg, Paul di Resta, and a couple of to-be-announced drivers. The only Ligier on the LMP2 grid will be fielded by Sean Creech Motorsport, and that will be the number 33, driven by Lance Wilsey, Joao Barbosa, and a couple of drivers that have yet to be announced. The number 52 Inter-Europol by PR1 Matheson Motorsports entry, well, they have announced one driver, and that's Jakub Schmakowski. The remaining drivers will be announced later. While the number 74 Riley Motorsports Orica will be driven by Gar Robinson, Felipe Fraga, Josh Burden, and a to-be-announced driver after they've moved up from the LMP3 class. The number 88 AF Corsa Orica will be driven by Luis Perez Campagne, Nicholas Nielsen, Lila Wadu, and a driver that has not yet been announced. And the number 99 AO Racing Orica, a new entry for the 2024 season, will be driven by PJ Hyatt, Paul-Loup Chatin, and two drivers that have yet to be announced. I feel like I kind of say this about every class, but don't sleep on the LMP2 racing. Consistently some of the closest racing that we see up and down the grid over the entire season, and last year's Rolex 24 finish was pretty darn good in the LMP2 class. But the class that generated so much buzz in last year's Rolex 24, the GTP class, has grown heading into the 2024 edition. The class grows to feature 10 entries, starting with the number 01 Cadillac Racing entry driven by Sebastian Bourdais, Renger van de Zande, and Scott Dixon. Number 5 JDC Miller Motorsports Porsche 963 will be driven by Tiemann Vanderhelm, Phil Hansen, Ben Keating, and Richard Westbrook. For those of you keeping track, yes, Ben Keating will be competing in both the LMP2 class as well as running in the GTP class, something that he has done in previous editions of this race. Some might say he's a little bit crazy for it, but you'll love to see it. There will once again be two Porsche Penske Motorsports Porsche 963s on the grid, number 6 being driven by Nick Tandy, Mathieu Jaminet, Kevin Estra, and Lawrence Vanthor. And in the number 7, it will be Matt Campbell, Felipe Nasr, Joseph Newgarden, and Fred Makawicki. The number 10 Wayne Taylor Racing with Andretti Acura ARX06 will be driven by Ricky Taylor, Felipe Albuquerque, Brandon Hartley, and Marcus Ericsson. We now come across the two BMW M-Team RLL entries. The number 24 will be driven by Jesse Krohn, Augusto Farfus, and Dries Vanthor. And the number 25 will be driven by Connor Di Filippi, Nick Yaloli, and Maxime Martin. Defending IMSA champions, the number 31 Whelen Engineering Cadillac will be driven by Pipo Derani, Jack Aitken, and Tom Blomqvist. And the number 40 Wayne Taylor Racing with Andretti entry, that is their second entry that is new for 2024, will be driven by Jordan Taylor, Luis Delatraz, Colton Herta, and Jenson Button. And yes, that is former F1 champion Jenson Button. And rounding out the GTP grid, it's number 59 Proton Competition Porsche, driven by Jean-Marie Bruni, Neil Johnny, and features a to-be-announced driver. Now, Acura is seeking out its 4th consecutive Rolex 24 victory in the top class. Of course, this dates back to the DPI era. But I must say, the two entries that they have this year are pretty darn strong. Although you could say that about pretty much every entry that's on this list. We're going to see Ben Keating pull double duty once again for this race, which is an impressive feat for a pro driver to do it, never mind the bronze-rated amateur driver. And of course, it's a grid that doesn't feature the number 60 Meyer-Shank Racing Acura, as they're taking a step back from IMSA competition for 2024. If anything that this entry list has pointed out, it's this. The 2024 Rolex 24 is going to feature an extremely deep grid, all the way from the GTD classes that feature a very large 25 cars, all the way up to the GTP class, where we not only see the factory entries this year, but there's also going to be customer entries in that class. Also, don't sleep on the LMP2 class. We're seeing so many teams, so many of the best LMP2 teams from around the world come to IMSA and make that class absolutely incredible. And full grids are great for one race, but they're amazing when you can keep the grid counts high for the entire season. And lucky for us, it's not just going to be the Rolex 24 that features full grids. There are a ton of the entries that we just went through that are featured on the full season entry list. You can check out this video to see all the entries that'll be featured on the full season grid. Once again, a huge shout out to all of the Patreon supporters. If you too want to support the show, then you can head to patreon.com/offintheesses. Once again though, thanks for tuning in. I hope everyone has a great race weekend. It doesn't go off in the S's.